If you're launching a podcast, it's a given you'll want to be on Apple and Spotify. Those are the big players everyone talks about, but what many don't realize is that getting your podcast on these platforms isn't automatic. Unlike some other directories, you'll need to manually submit your show to both Apple and Spotify to get it live. Don't worry though, it's easier than you think, and I'm going to guide you through the process step by step. Hi, I'm Chapman, and I help entrepreneurs launch and grow podcasts that captivate their audience and build their business. And today we're going to chat about everything you need to know to get your podcast on Apple and Spotify, including the step-by-step process, why these platforms are different, and how this extra step benefits you in the long run. But before we get started, I have a quick question. How ready are you to launch your podcast? If you're not sure, I've created a free quiz to help you figure it out. It's called How Ready Are You to Launch Your Podcast? And it will give you personalized insights on where you are in the process and what your next steps should be. You can find the link in the description below, so make sure to check it out. Okay, let's talk about why Apple and Spotify matter, how to submit your show to these platforms, and all the benefits of taking this manual step. So why is it okay to submit other directories through your podcast host that aren't Apple and Spotify? So let's start with why these two platforms are so important. First, Apple Podcasts is where podcasting really took off, and it remains one of the most popular platforms for podcast listeners. Because it's integrated into iPhone and other Apple devices, it's often the first place people go to find a new show. So if you're not on Apple Podcasts, you're missing out on a huge chunk of your potential audience. Now, Spotify, in the last few years, Spotify has really skyrocketed in the podcasting space. They've invested heavily in exclusive deals, podcast technology, and features that make the platform more podcast friendly. With millions of users actively searching for podcasts every day, Spotify has become one of those platforms that listeners are searching for new shows. So between these two platforms, you're covering a massive share of podcast listeners, which is why getting your podcast on both is essential and non-negotiable, as well as all the other directories that are available. You want to be on every directory that there is. So even with smaller directories, sometimes podcasters think it's not a big deal not to be on those ones, but it is. And I'll use myself as an example. I'm not an iPhone user, so I don't use Apple Podcasts. I don't particularly like the Spotify platform, so I don't listen through Spotify. My go-to is Stitcher. Then they closed down. Then my go-to is Google Podcasts, and they closed down. So now I listen through YouTube Music. So if you think you don't need to be on all of the smaller platforms, you really want to put your podcast in as many places as possible and make it as easy as possible for new listeners to find you. Okay, so why do we submit to Apple and Spotify manually? They want to ensure your podcast meets their standards and that you, the creator, have full control over your content. So the manual process also gives you direct access to important tools like analytics and troubleshooting features, which aren't available if you were to submit through a third party like Buzzsprout, Libsyn, Captivate. Those are third parties. So think of it like this. You're building a direct relationship with these platforms, which gives you more control over how your podcast is presented and managed. Before we dive into the step-by-step directions, let's talk about some common mistakes podcasters make when submitting their shows. The first one is incorrect artwork. So Apple Podcasts requires artwork to be between 1400 by 1400 and 3000 by 3000 pixels in JPG or PNG format and in RGB color. So if your artwork doesn't meet these standards, your submission will be rejected. Number two is missing metadata. So your podcast metadata, like the title, description, and category, need to be complete and accurate. This is essential for both platforms to display your podcast correctly and attract the listeners you want. Number three is feed validation errors. So you want to make sure your RSS feed is properly formatted and includes all the required elements like an email address, episode titles, and descriptions. If Apple Podcasts rejects your feed, it's most likely due to something missing, like your email address not being visible in the RSS feed. Most podcast hosts have an option to enable your email to show up for 24 hours. So you want to double check that setting if you run into this problem. As a side note, the issue with the email being hidden is that sites would go through and search for email addresses and then send you all kinds of just scam bot emails. So now a lot of podcast hosts will hide your email. But like I said, you need to make it visible during the submission process so that your show can be verified as you as the owner. Okay, now let's get into the step-by-step process of submitting your podcast to Apple. Step number one, if you don't already have one, you'll need to create an Apple ID at appleid.apple.com. This will be your login for Apple Podcast Connect, which is where you're going to manage your podcast. If you already have an Apple ID, you can use the same one that you already have. And then step number two, you're going to go to podcastconnect.apple.com and log in using your Apple ID. This is where you'll submit your show and access all the tools that Apple has to offer. And then your podcast host like Buzzsprout or Libsyn will provide you with your RSS feed link. This is basically the blueprint of your podcast. It contains all your episode information, artwork, and details. So you're going to take that RSS feed and you're going to paste that link into Apple Podcast Connect. And then Apple will validate it to ensure everything is formatted correctly. Then you're just going to wait for approval. It will say draft mode and just keep refreshing it and it will eventually say published as long as there's no issues. Once your feed is validated, Apple will review it and approve your podcast. This process usually takes 24 to 48 hours. Once approved, your podcast will be live on Apple Podcasts. However, the last several times I've done it, it's usually taken less than an hour for Apple to approve all the shows that I've submitted. One of the great things about the back end of Apple Podcasts is that it has really great analytics. And these will only be for those listening through Apple, but still really great information. You can see metrics like consumption rate, how many followers you've had, how many unfollowers you have, how many engaged listeners you have, because you can have listeners and you can have engaged listeners, and you want engaged listeners. Engaged listeners typically are those that have listened to 40% or 20 minutes of an episode. That's much more desirable than having somebody that listened to 3 seconds. So whenever I look at the metrics, I always look at engaged listeners because those are far more important than just how many people have heard a small snippet of your podcast. Okay, let's talk about Spotify. Their process is similar, but it's even faster than Apple. So the first thing you go to is podcasters.spotify.com and sign up or log in. You're going to be bringing in an RSS feed, not starting a new show. So just keep that in mind. So just like with Apple, you'll copy the RSS feed link from your podcast host and paste it into Spotify for podcasters. Then Spotify will send you a verification email to confirm you're the owner of the podcast. Click the link in the email, and then that will complete the verification step. You'll have to fill in some basic information about your podcast, like its category and language. Spotify typically approves podcasts very quickly, sometimes within a few hours. So it can take a bit, but usually it's pretty quick. Once approved, your show will be live on Spotify. So when you go through the process, it's going to generate your Spotify link. I always save that somewhere. I always save those in Airtable. So you can take that link and you can pop it in. And for a bit, it might say show not found. Don't panic. Just keep checking back. Eventually, if it's already told you that you've got that link, your show is good, it will show up. It just takes a bit. Okay, so in Spotify, you can see consumption rate, demographic data like age, gender, and even listener habits. So like with Apple, Spotify is just those using the Spotify platform. Okay, so we talked about why you need to manually submit your podcast to Apple and Spotify. They require direct verification, and then they give you access to tools like your analytics and account management. But when it comes to other directories like Amazon Music, Podcast Index, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, all those smaller directories, go into the back end of your podcast host to submit your shows, which is the best way to do it. The reason why, unlike Apple and Spotify, most directories don't have strict guidelines for verifying podcast ownership or approving your feed. They rely on the information provided from your host to ensure everything is correct and ready to go. So when you submit through your podcast host, any changes you make, like uploading new episodes or tweaking your show details, are automatically synced across all the directories connected to your RSS feed, which of course is going to save you time. And this is the same for Apple and Spotify. So even though you've set those up manually, you've used that same RSS feed. So it's going to take, anytime you've updated your RSS feed with, say, a new episode, it's going to push it automatically to the smaller directories and to Apple and to Spotify. So basically, your podcast host acts as a middleman for these directories, and it's designed to handle the technical setup so you don't have to worry about multiple submission processes. It's really just a few clicks, and then your podcast is live in all the places. Okay, now you know exactly why Apple and Spotify are important to do manually, how to submit your podcast to these platforms. So if you're ready to take the next step in your podcasting journey, don't forget to take my free quiz. How ready are you to launch your podcast? The link is in the description below, and it's a perfect way to figure out your next steps when it comes to launching your podcast. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more podcasting tips, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss an update. I'll see you in the next video.